Lost Islamic History, by FIRAS Al-KHATEEB. Chapter 1. Pre-Islamic Arabia. The dry, mountainous landscape of the Hejaz is not an environment that gives much life. Situated in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, this land can be described with two words: dry and hot. In the summer, temperatures regularly rise to well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with little precipitation. Further east, endless sand dunes mark a landscape devoid of greenery or permanent settlements. Yet it was from this harsh landscape that, in the early 600, a new movement emerged, one that would change the course of history in the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. What is geography of Arab world? The Arabian Peninsula covers an area of over 2 million square kilometers in the southwestern corner of Asia. Situated between Asia, Africa and Europe, the land is unique in its connection with all three continents of the Old World. Despite its position, it has been mostly ignored by outsiders. The ancient Egyptians chose to expand into the Fertile Crescent and Nubia rather than venture into Arabia's deserts. Alexander the Great passed by it in the 300 BCE on his way to Persia and India. The Great Roman Empire attempted to invade the peninsula through Yemen in the 20 BCE, but could not adapt to the harsh landscape and thus failed to annex the region. One could hardly blame outsiders for ignoring the Arabian Peninsula. Its dry climate is barely hospitable, even for the nomads who live there. Monsoon winds bring seasonal rains to the southern coast of the peninsula in the autumn, but these are stifled by the quickly rising landscape and never make it deep into Arabia's deserts. Similarly, rains from the Mediterranean Sea barely touch upon the northern extremities of the Arabian desert. The result is that the vast majority of the peninsula remains dry year-round. Parched riverbeds known as wadis run throughout the land, yet they are barely recognizable as rivers. When clouds gather and rains fall, they become gushing and powerful waterways, essential for the growth of the seasonal flora that manages to bloom in this dry land. Once the wet season is over, however, the wadis return to their usual, dry state, useless as sources of water. More reliable are the oases, small fertile spots surrounded by the vast expanse of the desert. They were capable of serving host to small communities, or as waypoints for travelers, but were hardly enough to sustain an advanced and large society. Who are the Arab civilizations tend to be greatly shaped by the environments in which they develop, and the Arabs are no exception. Everything about the life of the Arab was based around the harsh environment in which he lived. Due to the desert's inability to support settled civilization, the Arabs were constantly on the move in search of fertile land for their flocks. One theory of the etymology of the label Arab even posits that the word itself comes from a Semitic root meaning wandering or nomadic. The Arabs would spend the summer months around whatever oases or wells they could rely on year after year, trying to make supplies and water last by living on the bare minimum. After months of enduring the summer heat, they would migrate to the south, near Yemen, where rain fell in the autumn and fertile land appeared for their herds. The rain-fed pastures gave their flocks of sheep, goats and camels enough food to live off through the winter months as they pitched their tents and temporarily settled. By the time the rains stopped and the dry season began again in the spring, the Arabs returned to their oases and wells to wait out another summer. This harsh cycle had been the norm for the nomadic Arabs since time immemorial, and it remains in place for the Bedouin Arabs who still live in Arabia's deserts. In pre-Islamic Arabia, hospitality was of such importance that a guest at the home of an Arab was guaranteed at least 3 days of total security and protection before he would even be questioned about why he was there. This tradition was further reinforced by the Prophet, who stated that a guest has the right to be hosted for 3 days. The desert was not a place to be alone. With so many threats to the survival of the Arabs, community cooperation was essential. Reliance on relatives was the first line of defense against famine and the heat that constantly threatened survival. Families were expected to share resources and shelter, and the concept of pure individualism was strongly frowned upon. As such, the family, and by extension, the tribe, served as the most important unit within Arab society. Groups of families traveled together and were considered a Qabila, or clan, Several clans would constitute a tribe, led by a tribal leader called a sheikh. Tribal identity and belonging were vital in the pre-Islamic world. Belonging to a tribe brought protection, support and economic opportunities. Tribes would go to battle to defend one of their own, and tribal warfare was unnervingly common before the arrival of Islam. Competition over grazing lands and flocks regularly brought tribes into devastating wars which could last years and extract a heavy human toll on the participants. For the Arabs, struggle was a constant, against both man and nature. In a tribal, nomadic society like this, artistic expression becomes difficult. The resources and time necessary to complete great sculptures and paintings like the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Greece were almost non-existent. Yet the natural human desire to search for beauty could not be extinguished by the desert sands. Instead it took on a new form, language. Perhaps more than any other language in the world, Arabic itself is a form of artistic expression. Word and sentence structure is fluid, creating many different ways for a person to express the same idea. Poetry thus naturally became the de facto art of Arabia. Long, epic poems glorifying tribes and heroism in war were their greatest works of art. The finest poets were revered as celebrities in every way. Their words were memorized by the masses and repeated for generations. The 7 most magnificent pre-Islamic poems were known as the Mu'allakat, meaning the hanging ones. They were so called because they were hung on the walls of the Kaaba in Mecca, or alternatively because they were hung in the hearts of all Arabs due to their reverence for the poetic medium. Despite being an advanced literary society, writing was rare in the Arabian Peninsula. While a written form of the language did exist by the 500, it was rarely learned. Memorization was enough for the Arabs, who were capable of learning poems that were thousands of lines long by heart so they could repeat them to future generations. Memorization would prove to be a vital skill once Islam arrived in the peninsula in the 600. When it came to religion, the pre-Islamic Arabs were almost exclusively polytheistic. Islamic tradition holds that the Prophet Abraham and his son, Ismail, built the Kaaba in the valley of Mecca in ancient times as a house of worship for one God. The Kaaba was built as a plain rectangular building on a foundation set by the first man, Adam. From this shrine, Ismail was able to preach the monotheistic message to the Arabs, who adopted him as one of their own. Over the centuries, however, the progeny of Ismail distorted his monotheistic teachings. Stone and wood idols were carved to represent attributes of God. Later, they would go on to represent separate gods entirely. By the time of the Prophet Muhammad, there were 360 gods in the Kaaba. The message of Ibrahim and Ismail was not entirely lost on the Arabs, however. The two prophets were still revered figures in the minds of the Arabs, and even some of their basic teachings still held weight in this society. They certainly believed in the God of Ibrahim and Ismail, called Allah in Arabic. But they believed he was one among many different gods, represented by the idols. This belief system was far removed from the strict monotheism those two prophets had preached, and reflected influence from some Aryan religions to the north. Isolated Christian and Jewish communities existed within the Arabian Peninsula and also revered the prophets, but that was where their similarities ended. The sparse monotheists of Arabia tended to avoid complete assimilation with the polytheistic Arabs, instead creating their own insular communities. Who were Arabia's neighbors? In spite of being deep in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, far from more advanced civilizations, the Arabs were not completely isolated from their neighbors. The Romans had become a regional superpower along the northern borders of the peninsula in the early decades CE. By putting down numerous Jewish revolts in the province of Syria-Palestina, the Romans stamped their control on the area. For the Bedouin Arabs, this meant the presence of a wealthy and strong trading partner to the north. Merchants regularly traversed the western part of the peninsula from Yemen in the south to Syria in the north, trading goods that came from places as far away as India and Italy. The Romans were content to remain in the more hospitable and familiar lands of the Fertile Crescent and let the nomadic Arabs carry on the trade with more distant lands. To the northeast of Arabia lies the Iranian plateau. The rise of the Sassanid dynasty in Persia in the 200 CE ushered in a centuries-long struggle between the Romans and Persians, which would have its effects on the Arabs. The border between the two great empires fluctuated, but was generally in the Syrian desert, in the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula. Both the Romans and the Persians attempted to gain the upper hand by using Arab tribes, usually ones that had converted to Christianity, as proxies. Keen to use this conflict to their own benefit, two Arab tribal confederations developed into client states for the great powers. The Ghassanids founded a kingdom in what are now the modern countries of Jordan, Syria and Palestine, where they served as a buffer for the Roman Empire. Similarly, the Lakhmids controlled southern Mesopotamia and served the Persians. Both Arab kingdoms were greatly influenced by their overlords, who spent heavily on keeping their vassals well equipped in the face of the enemy. Yet the constant warfare between the two sides would slowly wear down all four parties. By the early 600, the Romans and Persians were exhausted by decades of warfare and were weakening behind a facade of militaristic power. The Ghassanids and Lakhmids too felt the stress of war, as they were mere pawns in this constant conflict. Most Arab tribes, however, avoided the external conflict between the two imperial powers. They were more interested in carrying on a profitable trade with the two warring empires than helping to decide the winner. To the south of the peninsula was the powerful kingdom of Aksum in Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia. Based high in the Abyssinian mountains, Aksum was a powerful trading state that connected inland African kingdoms, the Indian Ocean Sea routes and the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. As a crossroad for trade, it had considerable influence on Arab merchants, who dealt with the Akshumites in Yemen. Like Rome, Aksum was a Christian empire that had tension with Persia on numerous occasions. Control of trade routes running through Yemen was a constant source of friction, as both sides sought to turn local leaders into vassals. In the increasingly globalized world of the early 600, the Arabs were aware of their neighbors and became affected by events outside the Arabian Peninsula. Being at a crossroads of three powerful states meant being aware of international politics and having the skill to use rivalries to their advantage. Yet despite their precarious location, the Arabs were safe in the depths of the desert. They called their peninsula Jazirat al-Arab, meaning the island of the Arabs, due to how isolated its inhabitants were. This isolation proved to be greatly beneficial. The harsh environment meant that none of the surrounding states could invade and occupy Arab lands. The Arabs' traditional cycle of wandering and their way of life was mostly unaffected by regional politics and wars. In this protected environment, a movement would rise in the early 600 that would have huge implications for the surrounding states, and eventually the entire world. It would change the destiny of the Arabs forever, building on and using their unique abilities and doing away with the negative cultural traits that kept them as wandering, warring nomads. Geography, climate, culture and politics together all led to the perfect environment in which Islam could rise to become a world power faster than any other movement, religion, or empire in world history. It would sweep out of the deserts of Arabia into the battered Roman and Persian empires, conquering territories and assimilating diverse peoples, creating an empire that stretched from Spain to India by the early 700, the world's largest at the time. This exponential growth in power and civilization would have been unfathomable to the Arabs of the early 600, who were struggling to survive. Yet all it took was the arrival of a man who came with a revolutionary message and a promise to the Arabs of a new destiny, one beyond the sands of Arabia: Muhammad.